Well, I'd like to welcome everybody to the National Medal of Honor Heritage Center January webinar. This is the third program that we brought you since last year. We did one in, I believe, late October and then early December. Those kind of focused on Sergeant York and the York story. Today, we're pivoting in a little bit of a different direction. Our guest with us today is Connor Williams, and Connor was an integral part as a historian on the National Naming Commission for renaming some of the military installations, specifically Army installations around the country that had been previously named after Confederate officers. And this has been, I think, about a 2-year process. I can remember this discussion kind of going on for years prior to the naming commission. And finally, it kind of came to a head, I believe, in 2021. So welcome, Connor. It's great to have you here today.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. And thank you everybody for signing in from home too.
Yeah, we hope to get some great questions here at the end. We're going to go through about a 30-40 minute discussion with Connor, and then we'll open it up at the end for questions about the last 20, maybe 25 minutes. We'll see how many questions that we get. But Connor, kind of kick off. I mean, this is Martin Luther King weekend, which I know to you is a very important holiday. Kind of, lead off with that a little bit, and then we'll kind of get into a discussion on the naming commission.
Yeah, thank you. I'd be remiss not to note with the exciting parts of Zoom, I have a magic tie, I think it looks like, that's see-through. So that's never happened before. That's pretty cool. But I'm going to share my screen for a few thoughts to just talk about a little bit about how this fits in with Martin Luther King, but more broadly, just tell the story of the naming commission briefly to get everybody kind of on the same page. So hopefully this will share. And you're all seeing looks like you're seeing these slides?
Yes, I see them. Great.
Yeah. Well, I did want to start with this being Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, and that matters, I think, for the most famous speech he ever gave in his life, which is the I Have a Dream speech, of course. And we focus a lot on that speech about the way he ends it with I have a dream, and that refrain he keeps going back to, I have a dream that one day my children will grow up to be judged not by the color of skin, content of their character. I have a dream. And that's, in some ways, people think the entire speech, many. But what really strikes me is that he starts the I have a dream anaphora, the refraining. He starts that at about the halfway point of the speech. And he actually begins his speech by talking about the Civil War. You may know it's on the steps of Lincoln Memorial. And he starts by saying 100 years ago, or he actually says 50 years ago to make sure people get the Lincoln reference, the man in whose shadow we once stand emancipated the Negro slaves. And then he has this refrain, the first refrain, 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, 100 years later, 100 years later. And then he moves into this another metaphor of what's called the promissory note. And a promissory note, something we don't have very much these days with credit cards and Venmo, but it was essentially a guaranteed IOU from a bank. And he says every American was given this promissory note in the Revolution, but it's been denied to the African Americans for too long. And that he says, we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. And so the reason I mention all that is because for Martin Luther King, civil rights was not a new story. It was not something that started in 1954 with the Brown versus Board decision. It was something that had persisted really for 100 years, since the Civil War, since the first medals of honors were awarded to United States soldiers who were fighting against enslavement. So in that sense, the story we saw in 1963, the story we see today, goes straight back to the American Civil War and straight back to the Medal of Honor that was created during that war to honor soldiers who had conspicuous valor and gallantry far and above the call of duty.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, but also it's worth mentioning that as we celebrate Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, he would have turned 93 today if not for an assassin's bullet. So he is younger than Queen Elizabeth, and there's no reason that he couldn't be with us today still. But thank you.
Thanks. Well, Connor, if you can kind of explain, one of the things that's important to us are the Medal of Honor recipients who were recognized for potential renaming of these installations.
Absolutely.
And we're going to get into that just a little bit, but if you can kind of give us a little context, a little background on what the naming commission is and how it was created.
Absolutely. It was created out of another moment of national protest. So you go from the 1963 March in Washington to events that were happening in the late 2010s and the early in the year 2020. I think that as we write history, it's too soon to know, but there are some years, 1917, 1968, that are kind of major pivot years in history. And I think 2020 is going to be one of those for all kinds of reasons. But as you may remember, there was a nationwide discussion about Confederate honors, brought about partly by the march in Charlottesville, partly by the death of George Floyd. And racial inequities were being exposed in this country all over. And I think one thing people realize that a lot of these things are going to take time to fix, that there is no immediate way to fix housing inequity. There's no immediate way to fix, policing policy. But with that being said, people realize we still have United States Army installations, forts. Fort Bragg, probably the most premier installation in the nation. These are named after Confederates. In fact, of the 9, 4 of those Confederates never served the United States Army at all. They have no US Army service. And all of them fought against United States Army soldiers. If you were a soldier in the Civil War who died in the US Army, you didn't die in the United States Army. You did not die in the Union Army or in the Yankee Army or in the Federal Army. You died as a soldier of the US Army, the same army that George Washington fought in, the same army that Colin Powell did. And so the big push nationwide was, why do we have these forts? And Congress acted. Congress acted quite quickly. In 2020, they were passing the omnibus bill called the National Defense Authorization Act, which is the bill that funds the military every year. They just passed it. If you remember, there was some news coverage about how Congress pushed to give $40 billion more to the military than they had actually asked for in the most recent one. So this is an annual bill. It sets military policy and it funds every branch of the military. I think it's far and away the most expensive big ticket item that Congress does on a yearly basis. And through the efforts of Senator Elizabeth Warren and a few others, they put in the 2021 NDAA, which they were passing in 2020, a provision saying that they needed to create a commission to identify all Confederate commemorations in the Department of Defense and make a plan for their removal or modification. And they wrote the language quite liberally, no pun intended with the political party, but they said any name, symbol, monument, display, or paraphernalia in the Department of Defense that commemorates a Confederate has to be modified to end that Confederation. This was a bipartisan bill. It had support from both houses and both sides of the aisle in both houses. President Trump did veto it. And when he vetoed it, he not only vetoed this part of the bill, he vetoed the entire bill. So he vetoed things like you can see at the bottom there, paid parental leave for our soldiers, increases of pay for DoD civilians in combat areas, anti-discrimination. He vetoed the entire bill. And that set up a week or 10 days of pretty fast news. As you can see up at the top, December 23rd, 2020, Trump vetoes defense bill. And then in the week after Christmas, many organizations, including people like the Heritage Foundation, which is a very conservative, traditional organization, started saying, why did Trump veto this? We need this act. This is not the time to make a stand. The military needs its funding. And then on January 1st, 2021, Congress overrode President Trump's veto for the first time. You may recall there's a Republican Senate this time. And what I want to point out there is the override of the veto vote, they needed 2/3 constitutionally, but the vote was 87-13 in the Senate, and it was an equal margin in the House. So there was wide bipartisan support for this to go forward. And in fact, the people who voted against it were from both sides of the aisle. Bernie Sanders voted against this, as did Tom Cotton. So kind of both sides of the aisle were against this, but most people most senators and representatives were very much for it. And then, of course, no one knew this at the time. Then history reminds us that people don't know what's going to happen until it happens. But 5 days after they overrode the veto, the insurrection happened, and the Confederate battle flag was once again brought to the forefront of our politics as people carried it inside the halls of Congress. So this started the naming commission, and I'll move forward this pretty quickly. But the law created the commissioners to be appointed by both parties. The commissioners that were appointed and accepted nominations: the former commandant of the Marine Corps, the first woman to become a 4-star admiral in the U.S. Navy, the former head of the history department at West Point, a congressman from Georgia, John McCain's former defense advisor, the former selective service commissioner, head of the draft, former head of the Corps of Engineers. So these were individuals who were quite prominent in our nation's military history, long service of careers, more than combined hundreds of years of civil service and military service. And the way the commission worked, and I think this is important, is that we were the third point in a triangle, if you will. And I've tried to put the words next to what each picture does, if that makes sense. So if you look up to the top, Congress created us. They mandated our work. They gave us this charge. You must find every instance of Confederate commemoration in the Department of Defense, and you must make a plan for its removal. We didn't have a lot of choice in that. If it commemorated the Confederacy, our job was to make a plan for its removal. And we reported our findings to Congress. They were our bosses. At the same time, our staff, our direct staff, was 6 people, and the military provided dozens more to help us. So the Army especially supported our mission. All of our travel arrangements were booked through the Army, all of our office space, all of our communications. There was a high-ranking Army officer, or many, helping us out. We heard their thoughts, but at the same time, we were not beholden to them. Our job was to work for Congress. The Army and the military had no authority over us. At the same time, as you can see, this is always how it works, but Congress funds the military through these annual acts, and the military serves the people. We sometimes forget, but we have a civilian-controlled military in the United States, which is a massively important aspect of our society. And it goes back to George Washington in 1783, near New Paltz, returning the Army to civilian control, refusing to have the Army be a long-standing professional army outside of civilian oversight. So that was the setup of the commission. We traveled all over the country. We went to each of the 9 military bases named after Confederates, many twice. We spoke with anybody who wanted to speak with us. This is a picture of me meeting with the Adjutant General of the Virginia National Guard, and we're at the Virginia War Memorial. We went to Congress and briefed them. We went to West Point, Annapolis, and heard from any American who wanted to listen to us. We ended up writing 3 reports that we submitted to Congress over the last fall. And those reports, as we were charged, had a plan for the removal or modification of any Department of Defense asset that commemorates any Confederate. There were 1,000, actually, I can't make this up. The Excel spreadsheet ultimately had 1,111 items on it. So 1111 of Confederate commemorations, everything from a very small display in the Pentagon that shows a belt buckle to the name of Fort Bragg or Fort Hood. And we wanted to follow up on our congressional charge, so we reported them all. We made recommendations for new names for the forts. We made recommendations on some very large items, saying that Memorials, statues have to come down in some ways, but a lot of things, if there's a Lee Street in Fort Lee, Virginia, or if there's a Lee Street in Fort Bragg, we said ultimately we want the local commanders to have a say in renaming that, because it's not for us to pick 1,000 new names for every item. I should apologize. This next slide is a little bit, a little bit gruesome, but it suits the war. What we really encountered during our time, and I'm starting to wrap up, is the difference between memory and history. We heard many times from people that we can't change the names of these forts because it would be changing history. And through a lot of research and a lot of talking with historians and military figures, I came to kind of question that. I think we're changing memory if we take the name of a Confederate general off of a fort. But the history of the war is just as it ever was. And the history of the war, the memory we might want to have is of this charge. This is a Gettysburg reenactment, but the history is of the remains of soldiers being dug up at Cold Harbor. The memory might be a unit of soldiers, but the history is the amputations on the battlefield. And that was a key distinction. So ultimately, our path led us to talking about commemoration. And I think I'll pause at this point, but I'll just say that we talked a lot about how commemoration is actually about our future and history is about our past. So history is about getting every piece of what happened in the past as accurately as possible in all of its grimness and glory, the complicated nature of the past. I wrote a long part about this. I'd be happy to read later. But commemoration is really about our future. It's about what names can inspire our military men and women as they train and go for the future. And in that decision, the Medal of Honor loomed really large for reasons I can speak about later, may be evident. But 4 of our final 9 namesakes had received the Medal of Honor, and 54 of our final 87 had. So the Medal of Honor really played a large part in our considerations. The last thing I'll say briefly is that our process, it's funny, when you work for the military, the Army, Navy have a big kind of rivalry, as you probably know. And the Navy always said the Army slides have too much text on them. So this is an Army slide, as the Navy would say. But we got 35,000 recommendations. We listened to anybody who wanted to communicate with us. So congressmen, senators weighed in, government figures weighed in. Enlisted soldiers weighed in. We sought out their opinions. We went to these bases and met with them. Officers weighed in. Army civilians, people who've worked for the Army in a non-soldier role for 20, 30 years. Local communities surrounding these forts weighed in. We got direct letters. We actually got handwritten letters from Americans. It was very poignant. And we had a website where people could submit. So from those, we got 35,000 recommendations. There were 3,500 unique names. That is, a lot of people recommended William T. Sherman, but spelled his name slightly differently. From those, we determined that 450 of these were meritorious candidates, people who really, through their actions, their valor and service, could be a great namesake for a fort. We then got that down to a short list of 87 finalists. We engaged the groups again. We went to all the bases again, said, here's who we're thinking about. Do you have any opinions? We heard from them. We deliberated for weeks. When I say we, I supported the commissioners. I was not a commissioner myself. I did not have a vote in this, but I was their advisor. And we ended up with these 9 names. So that's as fast as I can do it, the short story of the naming commission, but I'd love to talk more about any of this.
Connor, briefly kind of go into what the criteria was for these names that you did choose, and kind of some background on that, if you can.
Yeah, absolutely. So the commissioners very early on established a list of criteria, which is all, I should say, our reports are published. This is the print copy, but they're all available in PDF forms online. And the criteria are listed verbatim in there. But essentially what they wanted was, whenever possible, the individual should have some relationship to the region or the fort that was being renamed. So in choosing, the gentleman in the bottom left-hand corner, Van Barfoot, in choosing Van Barfoot to replace George Pickett in Virginia, that is a Virginia story. Van Barfoot enlisted in the 45th Infantry Division, the Thunderbirds in World War II. They are based out of Virginia. He was in the Virginia National Guard for many years afterwards. He lived in Virginia. He retired in Virginia. So we tried to find Virginia stories to replace Virginia stories. We also looked at candidates that would represent the armed forces in its current composition. One of the things that is true for all the current base names before we came around was that there were 69 installations named after people. Of those 69, 68 were named for white men, and one was named for a Puerto Rican soldier. So we tried to find names that would represent the current composition of the United States Armed Forces. We also looked for uncommon valor or uncommon service. So not all these individuals have battlefield valor, but they all have service that's truly remarkable. And the last thing, which I will acknowledge is a bit more ephemeral, if you will, was that their stories could really inspire the men and women volunteering for our armed services in the future. One of the things that's very difficult is it's very difficult to tell the story of Leonidas Polk, who was, by all accounts, one of the worst commanders in the Civil War, who never fought for the United States Army. You can't really inspire a soldier going through the gates of Fort Polk with that story. But Henry Johnson, the new namesake recommended, is an African-American man who volunteered for World War I. Because of Jim Crow, he was actually loaned to the French because General Pershing wanted a lily white force. He ended up in a French uniform in the Argonne Forest months before any other Americans were even on the ground in France. His forward position was raided one night by the Germans. He was one of 2 sentries awake. He sounded the alarm. He fought off 24 Germans single-handedly. He was wounded 24 times. He fired his rifle till he ran out of ammunition. He threw his grenades, so he ran out of them. He swung his rifle like a club until it broke. And finally, he pulled out his knife and attacked others to save his comrades in his position. And that's a story you can tell to inspire others. So those are the main criteria.
Connor, one that we're very interested in at the Medal of Honor Center, of course, is Mary Walker. We have an exhibit on Mary Walker in our gallery. A lot of the recognition for Mary Walker took place on her actions in and around Chattanooga at both Chickamauga and then the battle for Chattanooga. And then, of course, she has a more storied career. When you dropped in to see us, probably at least over a month and a half ago, we were very interested in this research. What did you find out maybe about Mary Walker that potentially people don't know about her?
It's a great question. And for just for a broad overview of your audience, Mary Walker was born in upstate New York on the shores of Lake Ontario in the 1830s to essentially an abolitionist family. And she believed in full equality from the start. She was the second woman to ever get a medical degree from Syracuse University after Elizabeth Blackwell, who was the first woman to ever get a medical degree from any university anywhere in the country. She demanded on treating men as well as women at a time where most female doctors only treated men. And when the Civil War broke out, she was 28 and she demanded to join the military. And they kept on trying to put her off, make her into a nurse, and she refused that. And so she was eventually appointed as the first female surgeon in the United States Army history. What I think we came across for her, which is particularly inspiring, one is just that deep commitment to equal rights, which is against the grain of her society. The other fact is that she did treat people on both sides. She often crossed enemy lines to treat sick and wounded wherever they were. She was actually arrested as a spy falsely by the Confederates and imprisoned in Richmond for 4 months. And the other thing I think briefly, there's a large discussion about her Medal of Honor that is because she's the only woman to receive the Medal of Honor, to be awarded it to date. And she also did not have a combat role. But I think that if you think about being a surgeon going into these hospitals with malaria and dysentery and all these diseases that people are suffering from, you will quickly find a good deal of essentially bravery in that. And her determination, one of the things I like about your display in the museum is you have her at her actual height, which I think is 5'1" or 5 feet. But it is, she is a short statured person, even by the standards of her time, but her spirit is larger than life. And not only for being everything she did there, but also for inspiring service to all other civilians. She is a Army civilian, ultimately, is her job. She's a surgeon hired by the Army. And that speaks to a very long tradition of not only women in military service, but also civilians who work for 20, 30 years for the military. So.
I know that you guys went through a lot of names, as you've already talked about. How did you narrow all of those names down into kind of your short list for each one of these 9 installations?
Yeah, I think that there were a few different criteria. One that we really did is we really listened to the American people. And as I showed that slide earlier, we had these kind of 6 streams of information. And I do want to say we valued some more than others. And I also want to dispel a rumor that the number of people recommended as new names on the website had no bearing. It was not American Idol where the most votes moved on. In fact, the single largest vote getter on our website, our recommended name, was William Tecumseh Sherman. And the commissioners fairly early on thought that might be going a bit too far to recommend William T. Sherman to replace a Confederate name for historical reasons that are probably obvious. But we did say if there's a name being recommended from 5 of those 6 arrows, that someone is being recommended by congressmen and by the general public and by enlisted soldiers and by officers and by the communities, that's a name that really resonates for somebody. And I'm not going to try and fight against that as a historian. I'm so grateful for that feedback. So we looked at that. We also tried as often as possible to think, as I've said a few times before, but for stories that would have connections to these areas. So the gentleman in the center, General Cavazos, he's a Texan, and he's going to be the new namesake for Fort Hood. And he's a Texan through and through. Texas Tech, ROTC in Texas, born in the King Ranch as a son of a ranch foreman, retired in Texas. He is a Texan story that is really worth celebrating, more so than one might say John Bell Hood, who is the former namesake. So those were a lot of the considerations. And then again, I think that the last, I'll speak through an example again for Henry Johnson. When given the chance to kind of elevate one of 2 African Americans who fought in World War I, who both received the Medal of Honor, the other was a soldier named Freddie Stowers. And Freddie Stowers went over in World War I much the same way that Henry Johnson did. Freddie Stowers was killed leading a charge against a machine gun entrenchment. They captured the position, but he died in the effort. And we were trying to decide which of these 2 stories do we want to put forward. And ultimately, Henry Johnson has a story that continues afterwards, and it goes back into Jim Crow, and he's actually a victim of some Jim Crow society. So it's a story that can make us think about much broader trends in American service.
Well, Connor, I think I'm going to open up now to questions. I know we probably got a lot of questions from the people who have dialed in. That's an old term, to dial in. I sound like I'm on the radio.
I can actually just one more thing that occurred to me.
Yeah, go right ahead.
I also wanted to share that the other thing that was pretty clear, and some people expected the commissioner is, okay, if you have 9 Confederate forts, you're going to replace them with 9 United States generals, and take Robert E. Lee off there, put U.S. Grant on. Take whoever it is, take John Bell Hood and put on William T. Sherman or Philip Sheridan, whoever it's going to be. The commissioners really thought this was a chance to acknowledge and affirm military heroism throughout our nation's history. And in that case, to kind of get away from the Civil War a little bit, from not having it be a this or that, one side or the other, but say, instead of getting back to the debates about whatever Edmund Rucker did as a conscription officer that made him so unpopular amongst his own troops that he was actually voted out of being an officer, let's celebrate the heroism of Mike Novosel, a helicopter pilot who had been flying since he was 19 and who saved more than 5,000 people in the Vietnam War. That's a story we really want to elevate. So the commissioners looked for temporal diversity as well as just as new stories that would inspire.
Well, great. Would anybody like to ask Connor a question? Just type those in. And I get to be the arbiter of what is asked and what is not asked. Let's see. I think we've got one coming in here. Let me see how usually the questions come up here and I don't see one, but let's see if there's somewhere else on this thing.
I'll stop sharing too, I think, unless it's better to.
Here we go. We're open for questions. Got 3 people raising their hand and I'm not sure. Here we go. How is Eisenhower tied to Georgia?
In a number of ways, but most importantly, he actually gave the last speech of his military career, or last speech of his presidential career at formerly Fort Gordon. So he used to stay there a lot. Part of it, honestly, was to go golfing, but it's a place that he stayed quite often near Augusta. And his last speech as a military commander, different from his farewell address where he warned against military industrial complex, some of your audience might know about, was at what was formerly Fort Gordon and also now to be Fort Eisenhower. The other point that was kind of put forward there is that Fort Gordon is the head of the Signal Corps, or the home of the Army Signal Corps, which again, your audience probably knows this, but traces its days back to literally signal flags and telegraph wires, and now does all the web-based communications and all the cutting-edge communications that the military has. And because of Eisenhower's role in being the mastermind of the D-Day invasion on Normandy, all the communication that went into that, all the organization that went into that, it seemed like a very fitting name for that fort.
Why wasn't Camp Beauregard and Fort Jackson, why were those not subject to change?
Great questions. So it came down to legality at that point and the way that the law was written. And I will say that the National Park Service has its own discussions about these. We were connected to Department of Defense owned assets. So Camp Beauregard is actually owned by the Louisiana National Guard. And so that we didn't have any authority over them. The Louisiana National Guard has decided to rename Camp Beauregard, and they're in the middle of hearing from different individuals and discussing it, and they're going to announce their decision sometime this year also. Fort Jackson is actually named after Andrew Jackson. It's not named after Stonewall Jackson. And so for that reason, since Andrew Jackson was not a Confederate, it was not under our purview.
This is kind of a question that I had and somebody else is asking. Why did you use Fort Liberty instead of a person?
Yeah, it's a great question. And part of it goes back to we listened to the communities as much as we could. And in the case of Fort Bragg and the Fayetteville community, they were very adamant that they thought that Liberty was the best name for them. As you may know, Fort Bragg, or I'm going to say Fort Liberty, since the Secretary of Defense has signaled it's going forward, is the home to both the 82nd Airborne and the Special Forces, which are 2 storied military units in our Army's history. And the thought was that if we chose a representative from one of those, the other might feel a bit neglected, as it were. I also think that it's tough because Liberty, as a historian, American historian, liberty's been used for all kinds of bad purposes in our history. I mean, most famously, the Jefferson Day toast, where Andrew Jackson in 1832, when the nullification crisis is happening, this is when the first time the South is thinking about seceding. Jackson holds up his glass. He says, "The Union, it must be preserved." And John C. Calhoun holds up his glass and says, "The Union, next to our liberties, most dear." So liberty is not an automatic good in that sense. But the other thing that occurred to me is, if you think about the wars where the greatest number of Americans in the tradition of the citizen soldier signed up to fight, the American Civil War, speaking about the United States side, and the American Revolution and the Second World War, those are all wars where those soldiers really were fighting for liberty. And the first grounded our nation in liberty, the second expanded its definition of liberty, and the third made liberty an American value around the world. So it's out of keeping with the others, but a combination of wanting to listen to the local communities, and really also to to affirm that as a key part of our military history.
I've got one person that's asking if you could talk just a little bit more about, we've identified the Medal of Honor recipients that are the part of those 9 that are changing. Talk a bit about the others, and this kind of ties into another one. I've got someone here that's interested in hearing about Hal Moore's story. So if you can kind of go into that a little bit, that'd be great.
Absolutely. So I think that I'll talk about the Medal of Honor first, if that's okay. And first of all, just to point out, I think it's over your right shoulder, I think, on our background. But the original design of the Medal of Honor, which is still the design of the Navy Medal of Honor, the Army changed it, is Minerva, who's essentially the Roman version of Athena, but the goddess of strategy and battlefield wisdom. And she is casting out Discord, who is holding the snakes of secession in his hand. So the Medal of Honor is really a pro-United States medal in its design even. I think ultimately the Medal of Honor is the most, clarion, it's the most clarion evidence of valor and gallantry across the years. And in that way, it is something of an equalizer. I almost say that if someone is awarded the Medal of Honor, their actions are equivalent to others who have received it. And the other thing it helped us do is really focus on battlefield tactics. A lot of the old installations, and still are, because we only worked with 9 of them, are named after general officers. And general officers do incredibly important things. I don't mean to denigrate them at all. I'm so glad that the US has very fine general officers. But strategies dictate how wars are fought. Tactics dictate how battles are won. And oftentimes the Medal of Honor recognizes someone whose tactical efforts were so superior that it changed the outcome of a conflict. And also that the Medal of Honor in that case is representative of many others. George Patton is representative of a certain class of military leader, but Van Barfoot is representative of the 15 million men and some women who signed up, often with boots on the ground, just trying to figure out the few feet in front of their face. And so the Medal of Honor in that sense helps us think about the actual on the ground deeds of bravery and sacrifice that so many American soldiers have evinced. And one thing that your museum does very well, your center, is you point out that most Medal of Honor recipients, if you ask them, they don't say, "Oh yeah, I'm better than the rest," or "I was born to be a great soldier and my peers were all lackeys. So glad I was there to save them." They say the exact opposite, which is, "I did what anybody would have done, or what anybody should have done, and it's an honor to be given this recognition, but it speaks more to everybody in the military than to me." And I think that's a key point as well. Hal Moore, to pivot. Hal Moore, actually, it's important because it's intentionally Fort Moore, and it's named after Hal and Julia Moore. So one of the things that the commissioners wanted to do there was recognize the military family, which I am a grandson of a Army colonel, and my dad was the self-styled army brat. And, being a military family is a lifestyle all to its own. And perhaps nobody showed that more directly than Hal and Julia Moore when Hal Moore is fighting the Yadrang Valley in 1965 in the first major battle of the Vietnam War. His wife was home. And actually, one thing that's not always remembered, but back then, when soldiers were deployed, their families had to move off post. That was Army policy. So in addition to their husbands being away, all these wives were moving their kids to an apartment somewhere near the post. And when the telegrams, which were still Western Union telegrams, is how the Army sent death notices at that point, started coming in, Julia Moore, as the wife of the colonel in command of the troops at his landing zone, accompanied everyone and went to every funeral that she could. And together, both with the transition to the volunteer army afterwards, which Hal led, and his wife's efforts, they established a lot of the protocols that we have now about casualty notification teams and different aspects of that. So for all those reasons, the Moore family, and it truly is, I mean, individual soldiers might say Hal Moore, and that's their province, but according to policy, it is Hal and Julia Moore that helped guide that direction. And Fort Benning is where the new 7th Cavalry shipped out to Vietnam from. So
one person's asking, and again, this is a question that I've got as well, that shows up in the commission report. This is not a cheap process. This is a very expensive process to go through. Talk about that just a little bit, the dollars that are involved in changing these names.
Yeah, it's interesting. Far and away, the single largest price tag is not what I thought it would may be, which is the replacement of signs and repainting water towers, but it's what's called the fourth estate. And it's all the back end digital things that need to be changed, because the Army's taking this very seriously. They're an orders-based organization. They have the orders. They want to do it as perfectly as possible. So right now, when you travel, and some people who have the military background might know about TDY, it's temporary duty station, you go through a computer application. And right now, when you hit your drop-down menu, it says, I'm traveling from Fort Lee to Fort Hood for this training, and that's how you get reimbursed for your travels. They need to not only change those two kind of drop-down buttons, but they need to change every back-end code to change that. So in those cases, these names are actually being taken away from, for lack of a better word, cyberspace, as well as they are on the ground. So that is the charge. It's one of those things where I dare say that money is all relative. So the Army is the military is the greatest funded organization in our country for good reason. I'm glad that they have the technology to keep us safe. But the military does every year receive $4 billion to essentially meet whatever expenses come up. I don't mean to be glib, but it's pocket money in that sense. And so out of those $4 billion, the $59 million, or depending which report you read, price tag is not as much, though, certainly it's a large amount of money.
I've got somebody that's asking about, did you consider any soldiers of Jewish descent as one of the candidates?
We did a few, in fact, and Harold Cohen probably would be the most prominent, and Tibor Rubin, both incredible stories. Harold Cohen is with Patton and one of his tank men, and really helps lead the tank warfare. Ted Rubin is born in Hungary. He survives the Holocaust in Hungary. He then comes to the United States and signs up for the Korean War. In the Korean War, he's captured, and he spends a number of years in a prisoner of war camp, in which he sneaks out of the camp at night to get food to bring back to his fellow inmates at the risk of execution, obviously. And incredible heroism, not only just to sneak out, but then to come back and do these things. So we did consider, and it was ultimately, I have to say that our chair has a preface about the greatness of the American soldier that I so heartily endorse and agree with. There was no way to to choose every name we wanted to. What I'm glad to say is that the 87 finalists, and indeed all 450 of those, quote, meritorious candidates, we have forwarded to the Secretary of Defense, and we've essentially said, you should choose your own name for what's going to replace Stonewall Jackson Circle on, Fort Stewart. However, if you're looking for inspiration, here are some names that would be top notch.
Has West Point already, this is another question I'm getting, has West Point already changed their names, or is that something they're in the process of doing as well?
They are in the process, and the statutory deadline, which has been encouraged and reinforced by the Secretary of Defense, is that it should all be done by the end of the calendar year 2023. So we're just in the early stages of that. And actually, statutorily, the military was prohibited from starting until January 1st of this year. So they're only, 14 days into it. West Point has done a lot already. They've already taken down the Lee portraits, and there was this kind of bizarre triptych that some people read about that had the Ku Klux Klan on it, and they've taken that down to be modified. Some things like the new name for Lee Barracks, they have not yet done, but they're working on it, and they're excited to move out.
So what's the next step in this renaming process, Connor? Does this get presented back to Congress, or is it something that once it's been approved by the DOD that they have the authority to go ahead and make the name changes?
Yeah, it's a great question. And essentially we filed our reports over the late summer and fall of 2022. Congress had 90 days to amend or comment on them. And I'm grateful to hear that all congressmen, or nobody, opposed our decisions, or if they did, they didn't do it out loud or vocally. And so they've all been endorsed by Congress. And with that, it now goes to the Department of Defense. So essentially, barring anything that I can anticipate, these changes are happening. I know that the installations are planning their own renaming ceremonies. I was able to help contact some of the next of kin for some of these new namesakes. And I know they're all in the works of planning, fairly elaborate renaming ceremonies.
And so do you think that are those naming ceremonies going to take place at the bases themselves, or is that kind of what's being planned?
That's my understanding, yeah. And I will say that the commission is wrapped, so I'm a private historian. Once again, I still work for the commission on a gratuitous services agreement to help advise, but it's now at the fort level. There are a few things that are yet to be determined. Fort Belvoir in Virginia is named after a plantation, and the commissioners ultimately said, we're not positive if this explicitly commemorates the Confederacy, so we're not going to encourage you to rename it, but we also think there's some stuff you might want to consider about it. So we passed that on. There are a few other determinations like that, but yeah, it's in the Pentagon level, and then down at the local command level.
So what's next for the commission? You said that you've kind of done your work. Is there any other major changes at any other types of not specifically non-Army naval bases that are, you've got probably some that are named along the coast. What's kind of the criteria or the objective for that?
I mean, the commission has disbanded essentially. I mean, not essentially, but entirely. So we did recommend there were two naval ships, one named after Matthew Morey, who was a Virginian and a Confederate, and one named after the Battle of Chancellorsville, which you can't really spin as anything besides a disastrous United States defeat. So those are going to be renamed. The Navy names all their bases after locations, so they're kind of safe in that sense, and that they're all named after just places. I think that the broader question, and this is again up to Congress as people consider, is if there are other names that are not named after Confederates, but that might no longer match our nation's values, what to do about those. And I think pending any congressional action, they will stay. But that's, I think, the discussion left to be had. And yeah, I do want to say, just kind of ending this all, that I think there really is or not ending, I'm happy to talk for as much longer as you are, but that this is important to the commissioners, important to myself to say, just out loud is I don't want to, and it's not my job as a historian to go back and kick dirt at anybody in the past. I mean, I can only imagine being a 17-year-old kid who signs up for the Confederacy in 1861 and then sees his enlistment extended throughout the war, because that's what happens. If you sign up in the Confederate Army, you're not leaving. I mean, that's how the politics and law emerge. And you're in Petersburg in 1864 and you're getting 800 calories a day and you have no shoes. The last thing that I want to do is time travel back and say, I don't like you. I mean, they have different beliefs than I do, as most people from 1864 do. But this is really about the commemoration and our future, and what names will best inspire Americans for our future. And I think that what Congress decided was that in the case of Confederates who fought against the United States, whose forces killed United States soldiers, half of whom had never even served in the United States Army, that it was in the interest to show what our nation values in the present by finding new names.
And so where do you go from here, Connor? I know you've worked on this for several years now, and you kind of took a sabbatical from Yale to work on this. So what are your next steps?
Oh, thanks. Well, I'm doing a good number of speaking engagements about this work and writing on it and using it to kind of discuss public debates of commemoration and how those impact our present and the possibilities of our future. I'm also, as I think I may have said, writing already. And I'm also grateful to be advising some other institutions on their own hard history. I think that, any naming decision or renaming decision, if you're doing it ethically, you should churn some stomach acid about it ultimately. It's not an easy thing because it contrasts honoring the past as it happened and being true to history as it unfolded, and not trying just to cherry pick the parts of the past you like and acknowledge what happened in our history and making sure that's not forgotten, with the desire to have our current society reflect our values and inspire the next generation. So it should be a difficult conversation. And I think that's what happened in the Naming Commission and what's still happening with other institutions. So I'm also advising other institutions and teaching and excited to see where our country goes.
Well, fantastic. Connor, it's been great to have you on here. It's been a very informative discussion. We've had some good questions. It is a topic that I think is at the forefront, the renaming of these military bases. We're excited that those bases, some of those are going to be named after Medal of Honor recipients, most specifically in our case, Mary Walker. But we're also interested in all the other Medal of Honor recipients that show up, whether it's naming bases, ships, or other types of military installations, because they are our most decorated soldiers. And so, again, thank you for being on today. I want to thank everybody for checking in and not checking out. We've had on each one of these anywhere from 15 to 25 people. So we're excited about that. Be looking next month. We will have a program associated with African American history in the Medal of Honor. And then we've got some other exciting things in March and April. So once more, Connor, thanks for spending your early afternoon with us.
Oh, my absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And see everybody else hopefully next month. Thanks for joining us.